On the slopes of Mount Capure, there is a bog-laden borderland between the counties of Dublin and Wicklow, where a number of babbling brooks rise from the earth and carve a narrow path through a landscape that bears the deep scars of the human hand. As they trickle down the mountainside towards Dublin city, the tannic waters merge to form the flow of the ancient River Dodder that has passed through the green and remote glacial valley of Glenasmole over unimaginable millennia. Between this spot and the smoke-filled skies of the distant city of Dublin, a family by the name of Carne toiled in the fields on the slopes of the valley and built a home for themselves in the tiny hamlet of Pipertown. Little did the Carneys know that the river that gave life to their homeland would also bear witness to the decimation of their family at the hands of the landed gentry, who also called the river's bank home. From Glenasmole to Old Bawn to Terenure and Dublin city, past mountain cottages and grand country manors, the twists and turns of the river bore witness to the sad revelations of a story of oppression, rebellion, murder, and the brutal hanging of a father and two of his sons of the Piperstown Carneys. In the early 1800s, the peace of this district was forever broken by the disappearance of a despised land steward who worked on a nearby estate belonging to the powerful Shaw family. One evening, John Kinlan walked out into the darkness of a mountain laneway and seemingly disappeared from the face of the earth. His disappearance led to the arrest of Peter Kearney and his 4 sons. The body of Kinlan would never be found, but despite this, the authorities and local landlords contrived to exact a terrible revenge on a rebellious mountain family that would see their lives extinguished by the hangman's rope on the bank of the River Dodder. What follows is the story of the hanging of the Carneys of Piperstown, a family who rebelled with the United Irishmen and gave sanctuary to Robert Emmet, the powerful landowning families who sought to make a brutal example of them, and a hated magistrate and landlord who himself was destined to meet a brutal end. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next upload. These videos take weeks to research, film, narrate and edit, so I would greatly appreciate if you would consider sharing the video with a friend or family member who you think might enjoy the story. Today, the valley of Glenasmole retains a sense of separation from both Dublin city and the sprawling suburb of Tallaght that lies just a few kilometres to the north. The roads that skirt the valley's side were laid out with horse and cart in mind and are narrow and winding, barely allowing enough space for 2 cars to pass. When walking by the reservoirs at the valley's base, you are more likely to hear the sounds of birdsong from the trees and the bleating of sheep from the fields above than the hum of traffic and sirens. At the end of the 18th century, the valley was even more remote from a city that was then contained by the newly built Royal and Grand Canals, and the only clue to its existence was the ever-present smoke that lingered in the distant sky from the city's countless chimneys. Its isolation created a sanctuary for the ancient culture and myths of this land, and even for the Irish language itself, for up until this time, the people of Glenasmole spoke Oscuelga, and were likely the last community in Dublin to do so. On long winter nights, fireside tales were told under thatched roof of Fionn McCool and Athena, who hunted the majestic Irish elk through the forests of ancient sessile oak that once grew in the Valley of the Thrushes, and to this day the surrounding mountains bear the name of Fionn McCool. Today the valley's fields, as they have been for generations, are home to small mountain farms, and to walk through the narrow laneways is to pass through a Dublin that in most places has been swallowed up by housing estates and roads. In the late 18th century, more of the valley's steep slopes were cleared of gorse and heather and replaced with hedgerows, and small tenant farmers toiled in the fields and laboured on estates to pay their lofty rents. Tensions began to rise between the tenant farmers, landlords and their land agents, and for some in the community, thoughts of rebellion began to stir. One of these land-owning families were the Shaws of Terenure and Bushy Park House, who lived on the northern bank of the River Dodder, and two of their number will play a leading role in the story that is about to unfold. The Shaws had been an influential family in Ireland since the 17th century, when their ancestor William Shaw came to Ireland and fought alongside William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne, and was awarded a grant of land for his loyalty. In the mid-1700s, Robert Shaw, a successful merchant and accountant general of the post office, moved to Dublin following his purchase of Terenure House, a fine country home that had been built by the Dean family, descendants of Major Joseph Dean, an officer of Oliver Cromwell's army, who had granted him the land for his services. In 1796, Robert Shaw Jr. married Maria Wilkinson, whose dowry not only included a large sum of money, but also the Bushy Park House estate across the road from Terenure House, and several years later, Robert would make this the new seat of the Shaw family. Robert was destined to become the High Sheriff of Dublin, Colonel of the Royal Dublin Militia, and first Baronet Shaw when he was knighted by King George IV. Robert had a younger brother named Ponsonby Shaw, who also married well to Alice Eade of Stoke Newington and worked in the family bank. Ponsonby and Alice left Terenure and moved to an estate of their own in Friarstown, close to where the Pipertown Road begins its climb into the Dublin Mountains towards the small Carne homestead. Ponsonby began pumping money into his new estate, improving its fields and creating scenic walking paths complete with grottos, waterfalls and an ornamental lake held back by a 40-foot high dam. While the Shaw family steadily increased their wealth and influence downstream, the Carneys too were hard at work. The little mountainside cottage in the village of Piperstown was home to Peter and his wife, who by the year 1803 were both in their late 50s. They were tenant farmers on a rather small plot of land, but their hard work provided a good life for their family of 4 sons and 1 daughter. The eldest son, William, who by this time was in his early 20s, had recently met his wife Mary while on a visit to Rathfarnham, and the two had promptly married. As the cottage began to feel a little cramped, William and Mary took over the running of an inn on the banks of the River Dodder, close to where the Old Mill pub now stands in Old Bawn. The Carneys' second son, named Joseph, remained at the cottage and assisted his father in running the farm. Joseph had grown into a young man of powerful build, and he often supplemented the family's income by labouring on larger farms, particularly during the harvest. Both William and Joseph were popular characters in Piperstown, Glenasmole and Bohernabrina, as were the entire Kearney family. As peaceful as the green lanes and fields of the valley and mountainside seemed, resentment was growing in the communities of tenant farmers, both here and across the country, towards their landlords and their refusal to take their hardships into consideration. Calls were made to reduce the rents expected of tenant farmers and for landlords to try and improve their living conditions. In Glenasmole and Piperstown, like most other places, these calls went unanswered. In 1791, the Society of United Irishmen was formed in Belfast by Theobald Wolfetone, James Napper Tandy and Thomas Russell, with the aims of achieving Catholic emancipation and the end of British rule in Ireland. The secret society, inspired by the French and American revolutions, began to plan for a rebellion in 1798. William Kearney, frustrated by the hierarchy that refused to recognise the difficulties faced by their tenants, and driven by a desire for an independent Ireland, had become a member of the United Irishmen and is believed to have taken an active role in the rebellion of that year that was defeated by the British military. Within 5 years, however, another rebellion was planned, this time led by Robert Emmet, and William Kearney again answered the call to fight for Ireland. The rebellion was crushed by the overwhelming power of the British Army, and Robert Emmet was forced to retreat and go into hiding. While making his way to a safe house in the Dublin mountains, Emmet and his companions stopped at the Carne Inn at Bohernabrina. While they were resting, the local militia from Rathfarnham were a short distance away, conducting house-to-house searches to find the rebel leader who had a bounty on his head. Panic spread through the inn when the militia were spotted in the distance. Realising that there was no escape, as they would surely be spotted if they attempted to leave, Mary Kearney instructed the men to climb into the attic through a well-hidden door and to remain perfectly still. A few minutes later, the inn was surrounded by soldiers, and 3 of their party entered the building to search for the rebels. Disappointed to find the inn empty, the soldiers were about to leave when one of them spotted the discreet door leading to the attic and demanded for it to be opened. A quick-thinking Mary Kearney convinced the men that the attic was in disrepair and unsafe, so searching it would be both futile and dangerous. In this moment, she saved Robert Emmet's life, and most likely the life of the soldier that was about to poke his head into an attic full of heavily armed rebels. When the danger had passed, the group were able to make their escape, but for Robert Emmet, it was only a temporary reprieve. A few days later, he was captured in Harold's Cross, having returned to the city, and was hung, drawn and quartered on Thomas Street on the 20th of September that same year, aged just 25. Following the events of 1803, William Kearney was arrested and sentenced to prison, where he was to languish for the next year. Many more men from the valley and surrounding areas were also arrested, and some faced transportation to Australia. A letter of appeal survives, written by William himself while imprisoned in Kilmainham jail, that pleads for his release, as he remained incarcerated while others had been set free. The humble petition of William Carney of Bohernabrina in the county of Dublin, now confined in His Majesty's jail of Kilmainham. Your petitioner is now confined near 6 months under a charge of being guilty of treasonable practices. There was 8 persons arrested in the neighbourhood who are otherwise liberated, while I am still detained. What little property I acquired through strict industry is now entirely exhausted, and I have no hope of being released, except through your honour's clemency and great love of justice. William Kearney, Kilmainham Prison, the 28th of November, 1804. William was eventually released and returned to his family, but a dark cloud now hung over the Carneys of Piperstown and Bohernabrina. In the eyes of the Shaws and other wealthy families of the area, the Carneys were troublemakers who posed a threat to the very system that kept them in power. Over the next 12 years, the Carneys continued to work their small farm in the hills and operate the inn on the banks of the river. Peter Kearney grew old, and a lifetime of hard labour took a heavy toll on his body. Increasingly, he spent his days by the fire in the small cottage, while his sons took care of the heavy work on the farm. Little had changed for the tenant farmers of the area, and the same tensions were still rife when Ponsonby Shaw employed a new land agent to work on his estate at Friarstown. John Kinlan, a native of Galway, arrived in the valley and immediately set about earning the contempt of the local community. As an employee of the Shaws, he had some authority over many residents of the area, and he wielded it freely, harassing them for rent and threatening those who paid late with eviction. Frequently, his abrasive attitude led to violence, and fistfights broke out in the country lanes. On one of these occasions, a disagreement between John Kinlan and William Kearney led to a brawl between the two men, and Kinlan decided to make a complaint to the local magistrate. Later that night, Kinlan was drinking in the house of the estate gamekeeper, and having had his fill, decided to walk home. His friend, well aware of the animosity towards him, advised against walking alone in the dark without a weapon or an armed escort. Kinlan dismissed his friend's concerns and brazenly set out into the dark laneways to make his way home, and disappeared into the night. This was to be the last time that John Kinlan was ever seen, either alive or dead, and over the following weeks a terrible fate would befall the men of the Kearney family. When word reached Ponsonby Shaw of Kinlan's disappearance, he and his family immediately cried murder, despite the fact that there was no body to be seen and no physical evidence that a murder had taken place. Suspicion immediately fell on the Carneys, and with the memory of the events of 1803 still fresh in the minds of the members of polite society, the yeomanry were ordered to march on a small cottage in Piperstown, where every male member of the Kearney family was placed under arrest for the murder of John Kinlan. Peter, William, Joseph and the 2 younger brothers were shackled, put in the back of a cart and taken to Kilmainham jail. Over the following days, a thorough search was conducted for the body of John Kinlan. Fields, hedgerows, mountainous bogs, outbuildings and homes were searched to try and locate any sign of John Kinlan. Patches of ground that looked recently disturbed were dug up, but all these efforts proved to be futile. The disappearance drew the attention of another local landowner named Lundy Foot, who lived a short distance away in a large mansion then called Footmount that today is known as Orla House. Footmount had been built in 1790 by Lundy Foot Sr., a hugely successful businessman that created a tobacco and snuff empire based in Essex Street in Temple Bar that was so big at the time he was said to be more famous than Arthur Guinness. The immense wealth he acquired allowed him to construct his beautiful home and send his son, also called Lundy Foot, to law school. Lundy graduated from Trinity College Dublin and was called to the bar in 1788. He was an ambitious and spiteful man that relished in the power of his new position as a justice of the peace. Outraged at the disappearance and supposed murder of an employee of a neighbouring estate, he set his mind to pursuing and punishing the guilty party. The authorities were aware of the bad feeling between William Kearney and John Kinlan, but when it was reported that one of the Carneys was overheard to say that they will finish him whenever they got the chance, they proposed that Kinlan had been murdered to prevent him from making a complaint over the recent fight. They then focused their search on the family's homes. A hatchet was found next to the cottage in Piperstown that was stained with blood and hair. The Carneys explained that it had been used while butchering a pig, and indeed they were able to show that the animal carcass was still hanging in an outbuilding, but for the investigators, this was the proof they were looking for. On the surface it seems that the Carneys may have had a motive to kill, but it is important to understand just how much John Kinlan was disliked by the community, for they were not the only family to have had a run-in with this antagonistic character, and stories of his ill treatment of tenants were passed down in local lore for generations to come. Malachy Horan, a local farmer who lived on Killanarden Hill, was interviewed by Dr. George A. Little for his 1934 book Malachy Horan Remembers, recounted the following: "I will tell you one thing, that Kinlan was a hard man on the tenants. It was through his hardness that he met his end. But why the death of a bad man should have brought the deaths of 3 good ones, I cannot tell. No, I could never tell you that." Agnes Duffy of Ballinascorney also corresponded with Dr. Little and told him of the stories her father remembered from his youth growing up in the area. He often spoke to her of the fate of the Carney family and how unpopular Kinlan was in the community. Kinlan was disliked by all around, as he was known to be an informer and had been rather harsh in his dealings with the people. It seems in reality that there were many in the valley of Glenasmole and the village of Piperstown that were glad to see the demise of John Kinlan, and it was rumoured at the time that the community knew well where the body was hidden. It was perhaps a case of unfortunate timing for the Carneys that they had such a recent disagreement with the man, for any number of the community could have found themselves under arrest for his murder. Over the following weeks, as the prosecution prepared their case against the family, Peter, William, Joseph and their 2 younger brothers sat in a cold, damp prison cell in Kilmainham jail. Peter Kearney was already suffering from severe arthritis, and the damp and uncomfortable conditions quickly deepened the ache in his bones, and his joints slowly seized up. Meanwhile, an elderly Mrs. Kearney and William's wife Mary were left to fend for themselves on the farm and the inn by the River Dodder. Further downstream, Robert and Ponsonby Shaw gathered in the opulence of Bushy Park House, comforted by the knowledge that these troublesome tenants would soon receive their punishment, for with the great influence of their close friend and justice of the peace, Lundy Foot, the fate of these men was already decided. Despite the absence of a body, the trial of the Kearney family commenced in Green Street Courthouse before Judge Edward Main, in the same room that 12 years previously Robert Emmet had been sentenced to death, and many residents of Piperstown, Glenasmole, Bohernabrina, Ballinascorney and Old Bawn made the long journey to Green Street to support their neighbours. During the trial, the only physical evidence that could be produced was the bloodied axe, and the prosecution presented this to the judge and jury as damning proof of a brutal murder. At this stage of the trial, the Carneys had no legal representation, as the little money the family had at their disposal had already been spent purchasing food to bring to Kilmainham jail, and work on the family farm had come to a standstill. So the explanation that had already been provided as to why the axe was bloodied was not relayed to the jury. Let me ask you this: if you were to plan a murder and execute it so perfectly that within moments of it taking place, the body of the victim had vanished from the face of the earth and no signs of a crime could be found, would you then be so careless as to leave a bloody murder weapon lying outside your cottage? A neighbour of Peter Kearney, named Mr. Collins of Glenasmole, came forward to say that on the evening in question, Peter had been eating a meal of potatoes and buttermilk in their cottage when a shot was heard somewhere across the fields. On hearing the shot, Peter Kearney dropped the potato he held in his hand and looked towards the window. Mr. Collins intended this to be an alibi for Peter Kearney, but the prosecution instead stated that his reaction to hearing the gunshot proved that he was indeed complicit in the crime. As the trial continued, the Carneys realised that their fate was truly sealed. The absence of a body was to have no impact on the trial, as a law passed in the wake of the recent rebellions had made conspiracy to murder a hanging crime. The prosecution, therefore, did not have to prove to the jury that they had killed Kinlan or that the murder had even taken place. All they needed to convince them of was that the Carney men had conspired to commit murder, and in this they would be successful. Following a brief deliberation, the foreman of the jury informed the judge that Peter, William and Joseph Carney were guilty of conspiracy to murder. To the disappointment of Ponsonby Shaw and Lundy Foot, the two younger brothers were found not guilty and were released to their elderly mother, while the three older men were returned to their cell in Kilmainham jail to await sentencing. A few weeks later, the court reconvened for the sentencing of the Carneys before Judge Robert Day. The family had managed to acquire a lawyer by this time, but Burroughs Campbell's appeals to the court were not to be entertained. Lundy Foot had used his influence over his fellow magistrates to ensure that the conviction would stand. Peter, William and Joseph Kearney were to be hanged by the neck until dead for their crime of conspiracy to murder, and the execution would take place not in Kilmainham jail, but instead on the banks of the River Dodder in Bohernabrina, in order to teach a lesson to the unruly and rebellious people who called the surrounding hills of the Dublin Mountains home. Early one morning in 1816, 2 carts were loaded inside the grounds of Kilmainham jail. One contained a father and his 2 sons, each with a rope already tightened around their necks. The other contained a disassembled gallows and a hangman named Thomas Galvin, who in 1803 had executed the rebel leader that sheltered at the Carne Inn all those years ago. Outside the prison gates waited a troop of heavily armed dragoons, and next to them were several familiar and well-dressed gentlemen on horseback. And so began a slow, painful and vindictive journey towards the valley of Glenasmole, where the story began. The convoy headed due south, choosing a longer route than was necessary, with the intention of passing by Bushy Park House and the seat of the Shaw family. Among the thousands of people who gathered to witness the procession was an artist named William Sadler, who recorded what he saw as they passed through Terenure, then called Roundtown, in a sketch accompanied by these words. This sketch is of the Carneys' father and 2 sons going to execution at Bohernabrina, County Dublin, for the murder of the Shaw's land steward. There was an imposing escort of the famous 7th Dragoon Guards on Old Black Horse and 2 9-pounders. Captain Shaw, the High Sheriff, and Colonel of the Dragoons are in advance. I was present at the time as the melancholy procession was passing through Roundtown and will never forget it. William Sadler's sketch is the only known contemporary image of the 3 Carney men. As the carts approached Bushy Park House, Robert and Ponsonby Shaw, who were leading the convoy on horseback, slowed their pace to allow the Carneys time to look on the home of their captors. Here the 3 convicts were seen to drop to their knees in the cart and place a curse on the Shaw family and their future generations. Progress had been slow, and continuing on the final leg of the journey along the banks of the Dodder and through Templeogue, a greater sense of urgency was felt as the closer they got to the townland of the convicted men, the more hostile the crowds became. The dragoons that accompanied the procession were not just for show, they were necessary to hold back the crowds and to prevent any possible interference from locals. They made haste along the windy road to Old Bawn, past the old bridge that spanned the river, and past the inn of William and Mary Carney, for it was necessary to conduct their duty and return to the safety of the city before the fall of darkness. The procession stopped short of proceeding up the narrow road to Pipertown, and instead chose a piece of stony ground on the south bank of the River Dodder, just past the Carney Inn, to assemble the gallows. Mrs. Carney, her 2 youngest sons, her daughter and Mary were pushed back by the dragoons as Thomas Galvin finished his work and then turned to face the prisoners. Cries were heard from the crowd as Peter Kearney, who by this stage had difficulty walking, stumbled as he took his final steps toward the wooden gallows, and Joseph rushed forward to help his elderly father. There was no trapdoor on Galvin's gallows that would have hastened the prisoners' deaths. Instead, they were placed on the back of a cart, a noose around each of their necks, and then dropped as the cart pulled away. Galvin, perhaps rattled by the hostility of the crowd or the unfamiliar location of the execution, had botched his work. While 2 of the men did swing freely, he had not accounted for the height of William, who was taller than his father and brother. The crowd pushed forward and screamed "murderer" at hangman Galvin as they saw William's feet were just touching the ground, causing his suffering to be prolonged. Galvin took a shovel from his cart and began to dig a hole below the struggling man, and the noose claimed its 3rd victim. The scene was described by William Donville Hancock as follows. The dragoons were drawn up all around, and in a brief space of time, the wretched men were launched into eternity amid the screams of the women and execrations of the men, for the lower classes were ill-affected towards the government of the time. Old Carney's wife was with difficulty restrained by the soldiers from attacking the hangman. Altogether, it was a dreadful scene. At last, when the men were dead, their bodies were cut down, thrown into a cart covered with lime sacks from a lime kiln which stands close by, and brought back to Dublin and buried within the jail to the horror of their relatives. Well, I do remember, about 70 years ago, not far from this great platform, the Carneys' blood did flow. Then in our glen there were such men as Lundy, Foote and Shaw. They're gone away, a debt to pay, too high for English law. Following the execution, as Galvin and his men disassembled the gallows, The wooden structure fell forward, narrowly missing the hangman's head, and a roar of laughter was heard from the crowd. The Carney men were buried in unconsecrated ground in Kilmainham jail. It is unclear to this day if their remains were ever returned to the valley in which they lived and died. In the years that followed, the ornate grounds of Ponsonby Shaw's home at Friarstown were washed away when the dam he constructed burst and a great flood swept his gardens into the River Dodder. However, both Ponsonby and his brother Sir Robert Shaw enjoyed long lives following the hangings of 1816. Sir Robert Shaw died at the age of 75 in 1849, while Ponsonby lived to be 87 years of age, dying in 1871. The Shaw family resided at Bushy Park House until the 1950s, when the estate was sold to Dublin Corporation and some of the lands were retained as a public park. Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw was a distant relative of the family and was known to be a frequent visitor to the house. Lundyfoot's role in the prosecution of the Carneys would never be forgotten. He was despised by many in the country for his treatment of the Carneys, and following their execution, public anger increased. Foot himself was a landlord and had a reputation for cruelty when it came to dealing with his tenants. He eventually left Dublin to live in Kilkenny, and in 1833 was shot and wounded while travelling through Wexford. He recovered from his injuries, but 2 years later he was dragged from his carriage near his home and was beaten to death by the son of a tenant who had been evicted from his farm by the Foot family. Rumours were rife that the relatives of the Carneys had played a role in this murder, but James Murphy, son of the evicted tenant, was arrested, tried and hanged for the murder. The prosecutor in Murphy's trial was Lundy Edward Foot, son of Lundyfoot. In the 1930s, a skeleton was discovered in a sand quarry in Tala, and it was proposed at the time that it belonged to John Kinlan, although it was really impossible to confirm this claim. If he was truly murdered, his remains may, to this day, lie hidden in one of the many fields or bogs in Glenasmole Valley. Today, at the side of a lonely mountain path in the valley of Glenasmole, you can find a plaque dedicated to the 3 executed men. It bears the words, "In memory of Peter Kearney of Piperstown and his 2 sons, William and Joseph, 3 innocent men, publicly hanged in 1816. The plaque overlooks the land of their birth, the fields in which they laboured, and the river on whose stony bank they met a cruel and unjust end 209 years ago."